Hi, I'm Scott from the Rio Grande Tech team, and today I'm going to show you how to make a basket setting inside ZBrush. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got ZBrush booted up, and since we're going to be making a setting today, the first thing we're going to need is a stone. So the easiest way is to bring this in using our ring utility plugin, as in the Z plugin palette. Go to the ring utility plugin. If you don't have this, you can download this from the plugin section at Pixelogic's website. This is a nice way of generating gemstones. So since we have a clear canvas and we don't have anything else in it, if I go to the gemstones area, and we're going to do a round stone, let's make this 6.5 millimeters and uncheck on band because we don't have a ring. If we just try to bring this in by itself first thing, and we click Add Gemstone Subtool, we're going to be presented with this error message. And that's because it needs a subtool in the scene in order to append in this stone. So if you get this message, that's the reason. So I'm just going to click OK to get that to go away. And I'm just going to use this Polymesh 3D star. So I'm going to click on that, left click and drag, and immediately hit the T key to go into edit mode. And now I can go back to my Z plugin palette, into the ring utility plugin, and import my stone. All the settings are still the same, so I can just click Add Gemstone Subtool. One thing to be aware of when you bring in a stone without bringing in a ring first, it may not actually be to the proper size. So you do want to check before you continue. So right now my stone, it's actually labeled as round 6.5 millimeters. So I'm going to go into the geometry palette and go down to size. And you can see it's actually coming up as 0.5 units or 0.5 millimeters. So for here, I want to type in 6.5 because we're going to be doing a 1 carat and hit enter. So now when I start building my setting around here, I can take measurements and everything is going to be the right measurements. Now, before we go on into the project, first I want to address some feedback on a previous video. So when you install ZBrush for the first time, you are typically using the default material, which is called matte cap red wax. Not the most popular when it comes to sculptors inside ZBrush. So I wanted to show you a material that is very popular and is a very good representation of what your piece will look like after it's 3D printed. Here I have what's called, it's called Ma Dirty Blue. You can download this from the materials section on pixelogic.com, and this is an incredibly popular one. So for this video and subsequent videos, we will be using the Ma Dirty Blue. And shout out to Henry for reminding me to include this in one of the videos. So there we go. Now we can start actually building our head. I've got my stone in, and it's the right size. So I'm going to use this Polymesh 3D star to make the first component. We're actually going to be using a primitive from the gizmo, so we need a subtool in there anyway, and that star will work just fine. So to bring up the gizmo, click either move scale or rotate. And you can't see my star right now because it's actually inside the stone, so I'm going to click and drag on the yellow box in here just to scale it up a little bit so I can see it. And now we can go ahead and go into the primitives. So on the gizmo, click on Customize, and we want to select a cylinder 3D. So right now it's in the wrong orientation, so I'm going to right click and hold Shift to snap into my side view here. And we need to rotate it. So we actually need to go back to the gizmo real quick. So I'm going to click on this gear icon for customize and click on the Gizmo 3D up here at the top. And now I can left click and drag while holding shift to turn it 90 degrees. And I'm going to move it down because we're going to be scaling it up here. First thing I do is I'll grab the yellow box here and I'll scale it up until I can see it around the stone. And the reason that I do that is because we're actually going to be scaling this down just a bit, but this gives us an idea of where the outside edge is. Now, my personal philosophy when designing a setting is that when you're looking at a stone from the top, as we are now, you want to be able to see as little metal as possible. The stone is what's supposed to be front and center, and the setting is designed to complement the stone. So we don't want to actually see any of this metal around the outside edge. We will see the prongs, there's no getting around that, but we do make them as minimal as possible without sacrificing the longevity and wearability of the piece that we're making. So I scale this out just enough to where I can see it, and now I'm going to scale it back in just until it disappears, pretty much like that. So now the outside edge of this is just a hair under the outside edge of the stone, and that's perfect. So the next thing I want to adjust real quick is the height. So what this is going to be is it's going to be one of the rails around the basket setting. So it's going to be the rail closest to the top of the stone. Now, as far as the height of it, typically I'll aim the top of the rail to be just a hair under the distance between the girdle and the table. So look at this distance, and then look at this distance. You want this distance to be a little smaller than this. The idea is we want to allow as much light as possible to be able to get into that stone and make it look as nice as possible. So we don't want to have something like this where we're covering a lot of the stone. Something like this is just fine. So about this height. You don't have to get too exact and say it needs to be this exact measurement. That's not required. Just eyeballing it will be just fine. The setter is going to have some leeway in terms of how tall or low they set that stone. Okay, so the height looks good. I'm going to go back into Customize and go back into my Cylinder 3D. So we can make a few quick adjustments before we move on. So right now, this cylinder is pretty blocky. I want to make it a bit more round. So I've got a red cone here called H-divide. I'm going to click and drag on that just a bit to add a bit more geometry and make it a bit more round. And the reason why we are using this cylinder is because we can actually adjust the inner radius of this one. So for this, I'm actually going to go down here and turn on transparent mode so I can see through the stone. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to drag on this inner radius until we're actually still inside the stone, but only just. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a bevel on this top edge. So we actually want to adjust this inner radius until it's still inside the stone so that when we create our bevel, that's what will actually bring this top edge away from the stone. That looks pretty good. Once we do a few final adjustments, we'll actually come in and measure real quick just to make sure that all of our thicknesses are okay. But that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to go back into Customize and go back to my gizmo. I don't need a rail that's this tall, so I'm going to thin it up, but I'm going to do it in a very specific way. So on my move and Z axis, it says Alt to unlock. So I'm going to hold Alt, and I'm going to drag my gizmo until the middle of it is about even with this top. So now when I scale in Z, that top is not moving because we've already adjusted our height between the girdle and the top of the rail, and I don't want that to change. So I can actually move the gizmo to that spot and just bring the bottom edge up. So that looks pretty good right now. And while we're here, I'm going to turn on polyframes, and let's go ahead and take a quick measurement just to make sure we got our measurements okay. So I'm going to turn off the gizmo to go back into the transpose tool. And if you're unfamiliar with measuring in ZBrush, feel free to watch the video we did about how to measure things within ZBrush, and we kind of go into more detail about using this transpose tool as a ruler. So I'm going to hover over one of these corners and click and drag and snap to the next one. And it looks like our height is about 1.2 units or 1.2 millimeters. That's pretty good. And then we're also going to do for the bottom thickness as well. So I'm going to snap onto this one and then snap to that one. And we're at just a hair over 1 millimeter. That's perfectly fine. As long as you're within anywhere from 0.8 to say 1 millimeter, 1.2, that's fine. When you go into thinner things like 0.5 or lower, that's when things get a little too thin. So yeah, that's pretty good. That's right where we want to be. And if yours is not the right measurement, just Control Z to get back to the point where you're adjusting that inner radius and readjust, go through the same steps we just did, and then go on from there. So we're done measuring that. I can turn the gizmo back on, and it's kind of in an odd orientation now that we've been using the transpose tool. So I'm going to click Go to Unmasked Mesh Center, and I'm also going to reorient it. So I'm going to click the Lock Unlock, and then click Reset Orientation, and then lock it back into place. So now our gizmo is back to where it should be. So now we've got the top rail, now we're going to do the bottom rail. And all we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this. And we're doing this now. We don't want to add our bevel in here just yet because we don't want that bevel on the bottom rail as well. So while we got this solid, I'm going to go into my subtool palette, make sure that that rail is selected, and then click Duplicate, and then use my gizmo to bring that down. I'm going to turn my gizmo off so you can see a little better. Ideally, with a setting, you want the culet, the bottom tip of this stone, you want this to be about in the middle between these two rails. That's pretty common with stone setting. That's what you're typically shooting for. Again, it's just to allow more light, but this is very common practice with stone setting. So that's a good place to kind of aim when you're wanting to know how far to bring this bottom rail down. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's do the bevel real quick. So I'm going to make sure to select my top rail here. And for that, I'm going to be using ZModeler. On my keyboard, I'm going to key in B, Z, and M for ZModeler. To add in a bevel, I'm going to hover over one of these edge loops on the inside, and I'm going to press and hold spacebar and select Bevel for edge actions, and make sure that my target is edge loop complete. And then I can release spacebar. So now, when I hover over this edge and left click and drag, it's going to create that bevel there. And you can see the edge coming away from the stone. That's exactly what we want. And it doesn't have to line up perfectly. You can have a gap there that's actually preferred because the stone is not actually going to be sitting on this bevel. It's going to be held up by the prongs. But it will create a bit of light that's able to get through the metal and the stone. And a bevel like that is pretty much all you need. But while we're in ZModeler, there is one more thing I'm going to do. So once we start actually adding subdivisions to this, we're going to lose our nice sharp corners. I want to keep those solid right around this outside edge, this corner, this corner, this corner. I want to keep those as nice and crisp as possible. So I'm going to add creasing to them. So I'm going to hover over one of these edges here, press and hold spacebar, and under Edge Actions, I'm going to select Crease, and for Target, Edge Loop Complete, and then release spacebar. So now, when I click on one of these edge loops, you can barely see it, but it added a bit of a line on either side of this edge, and that will keep those nice and sharp. So I need to do that on all of these around the rail. So I need to click on this one up here, this one down here at the bottom, and also the outside one here. And while we're at it, I can go ahead and add creasing to the bottom one because we want that one to stay nice and sharp as well. So I'm going to select that one. Creasing is still selected, so I can click there, click there, click there, and on this inside one as well. So there we go. Now we've added creasing to both of those rails, so as we start adding subdivisions, they'll remain nice and sharp. So now I can actually turn off polyframes and turn off my transparent mode. So if we want to take a look, now we have this nice little bevel on the inside of the top rail, the bottom rail is nice and solid, and now we can start adding our prongs. So to add prongs, what we're going to do is we're going to append in a cylinder. So in the subtool palette, we're going to go to Append and click on Cylinder 3D and then select it. And right now it's actually inside the stone. I can turn transparent mode back on to see it a little better. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to size it. I'm going to go into the geometry palette, and just like any subtool you bring into ZBrush, it usually starts out as 2x2x2 most of the time. So now I have to decide what thickness I want my prong. So ideally, prongs for a center stone, you do want to be a little thicker, but more often than not, you're going to be somewhere in the 1 to 1.2 millimeter range for something of this size, like a 1 carat. You can always look at pieces of jewelry and see how the prongs scale next to a stone and judge based on that how thick to make it. I'm going to be making these 1.2, so in the XYZ size I'm going to key in 1.2 and hit enter. And now I'm going to bring up my gizmo by clicking on the Move tool. I'm just going to grab the little outside corner so I can move it freely and move it about 730 or so. We are going to be mirroring this around, but you have a little leeway. We want this to be right at about a 45-degree angle. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and move it up above the stone. When you're placing your prongs, you do want a bit of overlap. So let me zoom in, and you can I'll turn off the gizmo so you can see a little bit better. So you can see the line of the stone right here. Now my cursor, this little point, is snapping to about the center point. Now when you're setting a stone, you typically want the stone to not go any further than 50% into the prong. And the reason for that is this area out here where this metal is, that's what's going to be subjected to the elements. So things like rubbing up against tables or bumping into something, this is the area that's going to get the most wear and tear. So if you're if your stone is cut most of the way through this prong, you don't have a whole lot of metal actually protecting the stone from the elements. And over time, that prong can snag on a piece of clothing, gets ripped off, and then possibly your stone falls out. So yeah, ideally, don't go more than 50% into the stone. Typically, you'll want to be around 40 to 30% is a good bet. And some of this will depend on the setter who's setting it. But this is a good bet. We're at about 40%, maybe might move it out just a bit more. So something like that. And that will be just fine. That's going to give the setter plenty of room. And since we're going to be making this for manufacturing purposes, we do want the prong to sit up a little taller. In fact, why don't we go ahead and stretch it all the way down real quick. I'm going to turn off transparent mode. I don't want to adjust the top of this just yet, so I'm going to hold Alt and move my gizmo up here. And now I can use the scale Y. Looks like I didn't get it quite on the top, but close enough. And drag out that prong until it's actually below the bottom rail. I'll show you why that's going to be important here in just a bit. But you do want the bottom of this prong actually sticking a little bit past this rail, and we are going to be clipping it off. You want a bit of height with your prong. It's better to have too much prong on top than too little, because the person setting it after it's cast will always be able to remove metal, but putting it back is much more difficult. So don't be afraid to have a bit of extra metal on top, and that will allow the setter to have plenty of prong to bend over. The ends of these prongs will get shaped after it's set, so some of that metal will be removed. So yeah, don't be afraid to add a little bit of extra height. You don't have to go crazy with it and have them all the way out here, but give it just a bit of extra height, and that way it'll make setting that much easier. So that looks pretty good. I've got a nice height, got it just below the surface here. Now let's go ahead and make the other ones. So to mirror this to the other side, we are going to go into the geometry palette, and we're going to click on Modify Topology. And inside is a command called Mirror and Weld. And on this, you can actually mirror and weld in different axes. So we have the X, the Y, and the Z. So right now we have it selected as the X-axis. So when I click Mirror and Weld, it's going to mirror that prong to the other side. And one thing to notice real quick is that when you do a mirror and weld, it automatically merges those two together. So just keep that in mind. So now we're going to do a mirror and weld on the Z-axis. And since these have already been grouped together, we can just click it again. And now we have our prongs on this side as well. Okay, so now we've got the kind of basics there. Let's start cleaning it up and making it look nice. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my subtool palette here. We are going to be dynameshing these together. So the first thing we need to do is we need to merge them. So I'm going to select the top rail here, and I'm going to go to the Merge menu and click Merge Down, and just click OK. And then I'm going to click it again to merge those two rails with the prongs. And there we go. So now all those have merged together. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you dynamesh with this kind of blocky edges here, dynamesh will actually retain some of that blockiness and just kind of add geometry around it. So one thing I'm going to do first to kind of smooth it out is I'm just going to add some subdivisions. So I'm going to click in the geometry palette, I'm going to click divide a few times. So something like that, just to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And you can see how when you add subdivisions like that, it kind of creates a bit of a bevel. That's why we have the prongs a little bit overlapping. So now I can go in with my gizmo in the scale Y, and where it says hold control to clip. So I'm going to hold control and click and drag just to clean up that bottom edge a little bit, and now everything looks nice and uniform. So now I can go ahead and dynamesh this. So in the geometry palette, I'm going to go to dynamesh. And you can play with the resolution as you want. I am going to turn blur down to 0, but I'm going to leave the resolution where it's at. And just click dynamesh. Oh, and that's right, I forgot to delete the lower subdivisions. So that will take care of it. If it gives you that message, just say no. It'll delete them for you. But now we have dynameshed this model. But yeah, if you haven't clicked dynamesh yet, just make sure to click delete lower up here to delete those lower subdivisions, and then run your dynamesh. So this is pretty good. In fact, if I turn off the stone real quick, we can get a better look at it, and turn off the gizmo. So everything's looking good right now. But there is one more thing I want to do just to make this look a little nicer. So right now we have this setting that's very much straight, but most settings have a taper to them. So we're going to add a taper to this one as well. And the way we're going to do that is through masking. I'm going to hold control on my keyboard. We are going to be using the mask pen. So for my stroke modifiers, I'm going to go into drag rectangle, and I'm going to add alpha 27, which is a gradient alpha. Now right now it's a gradient from left to right, so we need to actually change that to up and down, because what's going to happen is this area up here will be darker, and then we'll have a gradient all the way down, so that way when we start moving things, this area will move the most, this the least, and we'll get a nice taper out of it. So to change the orientation of this alpha, make sure you have control held down on your keyboard, and while I've got it held down, I'm going to go into the alpha palette, and you can see my alpha here. I'm going to click rotate one time, and that way when I do my mask, so I'm going to hold control and drag out this box, and you can see we've added a nice gradient mask onto this, onto our head here. I'm going to bring the gizmo back up, and I'm going to hold Alt and move in Y to move it right to the bottom here. Not only do we have scaling in just one direction, you can see if I hover over this box here, it says Alt to scale in X and Z. So we have the Z-axis and the X-axis, and that's what we want to use to actually give this a nice taper. So I'm going to hold Alt and then left click and drag and bring those in a little bit, just to give this ever so much of a taper. You don't have to go as extreme as that. It can be very subtle. That is completely up to you. Just don't go too far. You will actually start to change the sizes here. So you'll get prongs that aren't as thick. The prongs up here will be shaped after the stone is set, so that's not as big a deal. But just don't go too far with it. If you really want an extreme taper, you would have to build this a little bit differently. You would have to actually build it tapered from the beginning. So that's actually just fine. So I'm going to control, click and drag off to the side to clear my mask. And then while I'm at it, I'm going to control, click and drag to re-dynamesh. So you'll notice too that you get a little bit of kind of waviness just from that tapering process. A quick way to take care of that, you can always go in with like a smoothing brush to clean that up. I'm going to go into the deformation palette, And I'm going to do a polish crisp edges. So I'm going to click on here to open that up, and I'm going to drag this up to say 6 or 7. Still a bit of waviness, but that's much easier to take care of with a smooth brush. So I'm going to turn on symmetry since I've got 4 prongs. So go into the transform palette, click activate symmetry. We're going to need this on the y-axis, so deselect X and click on the y-axis. And since we have 4 prongs, I'm going to click on this R to turn on radial symmetry, and click in there and type 4. So now I can clean up each one of these prongs at the same time, and just hold Shift. A few quick strokes will take care of it. So that's looking really good. I'm really happy with that. So one last thing that's more of a kind of a cleanup thing is right now we're sitting at around 711,000 points for this model. Relatively low poly in the scheme of things, but we can actually get it much lower poly just for storage purposes, and if we're working on a really complex model that already has a high poly count. Something like this that's a very basic part doesn't need to have such a high poly count on this. So let's see if we can bring that down just a bit. I'm actually going to do a ZRemesh. So go into geometry, and we're going to select the ZRemesher. And at first, typically I'll try default settings to do this. And by the way, make sure to have symmetry turned off. So I'm going to hit X on my keyboard to turn symmetry off. Running ZRemesher with symmetry on can have some interesting results to your model. It can really help if you're trying to create symmetrical geometry, but it would provide us some weird results if we had symmetry on while we're ZRemeshing this one. So I'm just going to keep the default settings and see what that comes out like. So let's go ahead and click ZRemesher, and we'll let that run. Because ideally, I want to get this down to a lower poly count. So when I bring it in later, I have more room to add detail to the rest of the piece. And to be honest, I'm not really liking that. You can see I'm getting a bit of weirdness around these corners here. Yeah, let's go ahead and Control Z to undo that. And I'm going to make one little change. For my target polygons count, I'm going to bring that up to 15. Run ZRemesher again. Because ideally, we're going to double check it afterwards, but we'll ZRemesh and then we'll subdivide it a couple times just to see what it's going to look like afterwards. But we'll let this run for just a sec. See, that's looking better. There's still a bit of weirdness here, but it's not too bad, and I'm guessing that'll go away once we add some more subdivisions. And we've retained the basic shape of the setting. Our bevel is intact, and we're only at around 21,000 polys now, so we're pretty good. This is where I would probably save it as a low poly model. And let's go ahead, and I'm just going to add a few subdivisions. So I'm going to click subdivide a couple times. And you can see that it's pretty smooth now. So when I bring this in and start adding subdivisions to the bigger piece that I'm going to be sculpting, everything will look just fine. And something like these little areas, yeah, these, you got to keep in mind with a head that it's going to be pre-polished. These areas up on top are going to be bent over and reshaped. There's going to be tool marks from the setting process back here, so those will get polished. There will be some work that is done to this head after the fact. But I'm going to Control Z, get back to my original low poly model. And this is where I would actually save this as a Z tool. So up here in this tool menu, click Save As and save this as a 1 carat head or whatever you want to do. You can scale this up and down, but the main reason I wanted to demonstrate this method of making a basket setting, there are other methods that I've seen. I prefer this way because it's controllable. I can control the thickness and height of these rails. I can control the thickness of these prongs, and everything is going to be exactly the way I want it, rather than some of the other methods that are out there. So it's a very controllable way of making a head. So that's pretty much it. Just make sure to save it. If you do want to do any sculpting on it, now is a good time, because we've made it. We've got a nice low poly model. We can add some subdivisions, do some sculpting on it, or convert it back to dynamesh or whatever you want to do. So yeah, that's kind of a quick and dirty and controllable way of making a 4-prong basket setting. So if you have any questions, always feel free to contact us.